Today I'm going to begin with chapters out of the ebook Preparing for the Worst, a Self-Reliance Reference Guide. Here is the table of contents, and you can see it's in the most basic form, separated into Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 involves basic preparation in many different ways, and Part 2 is when disaster strikes, which is the application of the knowledge gained in Part 1. There is also an appendix with some forms and worksheets and a decent glossary of terms as well at the end. So really today we're just going to start with the first part of basic preparation. So the first module in basic preparation is the essentials. The essentials are broken down into shelter, water, food, fire, and heat. So the first module in there is shelter. So there's some things we have to consider really with shelter. So by now a lot of people know about the rules of threes and talks about this, right? 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. So every situation is different, and although you may find yourself in a temperate area with abundant food and water, it's rare. So all things being equal, this book here, with all things being equal, considers the elements to be the first thing to kill you. So if you're lost in a snowstorm and you don't make shelter quickly, you really don't have to worry about being hungry or thirsty. If you're out in the desert, sure you need water, absolutely. But before you dehydrate to death, you'll probably go into severe heat stroke. So with all things being equal, shelter is what we're going to concentrate on first. So there's some basic principles of shelter. And remember too, this is about shelter and climate control. The lady here on the beach is demonstrating 4 real basic but essential principles of thermodynamics, those being radiation, convection, conduction, and evaporation. So radiation, heat from the sun, for example, a fire or warm rocks, that heat being given off into an environment, or heat being, say, given off or dissipating through layers of layers of clothing from your body into the air. So this is a great principle to understand when choosing a location to shelter or making your disaster situation better. Convection. This is generally about cold or warm air or water moving around an object which heats or cools it. This is also applicable to the rising of warm air and falling of cool air. Convection can be controlled to your advantage in many ways. For example, you can use a breeze to blow heat away from you or to cool your immediate environment, or to draw the warmth of a fire or heater towards you, right? Conduction is where an object loses or gains heat through direct contact with something, so a little bit different than convection, right? This is being in direct contact with something that heats or cools an object, you for instance. So if you're immersed in cold water or laying on a cold ground, having a warm water bottle with you in your sleeping bag, for example, right by you. Or here, this lady sitting in the sand is being warmed by the warm sand. And then there's evaporation, and essentially that is the cooling that happens through the evaporation of a liquid. So for example, sweat or water on your skin, which evaporates. Liquid requires an extra boost of energy to go from its liquid state into a gas state. And so the energy that's transferred into that phase shift is perceived as a cooling sensation or effect on the skin. So all of these can be manipulated to conform to your individual scenario, even without lots of gear or years of survival training. Just understanding these basic principles here can really go a long ways. So let's talk about getting too cold, for example. If your body temperature falls below 95 degrees, you become hypothermic. So in the early stages, you start to lose your fine motor skills and have trouble really performing basic tasks. You know, into the 90 degree down to 82 degree Fahrenheit is moderate, and your core temperature has really started to fall now. You start to shiver, you have extreme problems with numbness, some slurring of speech, and then drifting anywhere below that is very severe hypothermia. And you're talking about situations where you're starting to turn blue in color in your skin. We see people's behavior really change. Sometimes they can get very combative, or they start to shed layers of clothing, thinking that they're warm when they're not at all. And then, of course, you start to go into a stage where you're just falling asleep, you're listless, you have no energy anymore, and some people just simply give up and die. So there's also some things that happen when you get extreme cold that aren't necessarily related to hypothermia, and that can be things like frostbite. Well, we're talking about climate control here and creating a microclimate around your body. Frostbite doesn't necessarily sound like a whole lot, but it can actually be pretty severe. There's 4 stages listed in frostbite. Stage 1 is not that big of a deal. It happens on your face a lot of the time. You get kind of a red, patchy, itchy sort of areas in your skin. There's from wind burn, for example, frost nip, things like that. Stage 2, now your skin starts to drop in temperature and it begins to actually freeze. The water in your skin is the problem here, just like the water in a bottle out in freezing temperatures. So it begins to harden and become rough. Damage to the cells occurs. Maybe even some rupturing of the cells. Once the frostbitten area is warmed again, the skin usually looks quite bruised. It can possibly have some blister areas. But in this stage, it will heal. Now, going above that, in stage 3 frostbite, you have pretty serious destruction of the cells and even the blood vessels in the skin. Your skin's very firm. It has almost a plastic, fatty type of look to it. You can have definite permanent loss occurring in these areas. Bruise-like areas and blisters will last for months in some cases, certainly weeks. Some of it may not actually even heal all the way, and you can have some nerve damage. Continuing into stage 4, you definitely see extensive nerve damage, infection in the dead areas that can occur. Sometimes those areas don't come back and they actually need to be removed, tips of fingers and toes, things like that. So to treat a case of frostbite, it talks about here warming the affected area gradually and allowing circulation to return slowly. There are different schools of thought on this, and a few sources that cite rapid warming. But the fact is most experts really do agree warming frostbitten skin too quickly can cause further damage and some irreversible damage at that. So avoid running underwater that's too warm, for example, or placing the area, say your hands, too near a fire or a heater. Rewarming does need to happen as soon as possible, but it probably shouldn't happen too fast. In this particular case, I really recommend erring on the side of caution and doing it a little bit slower and trying to get the sensation and the blood flow back slower. Now, to prevent frostbite and not have to deal with this at all, don't wear tight clothing, or restrictive shoes or boots or socks. Allow the blood flow to continue through the extremities and back into your core. We'll talk a little bit about controlling core temperature here to keep that blood up to temp. As it goes out into your extremities, it will cool, but you want that blood to flow. You want to keep areas in the extremities and outside, like on your face, nose, ears, things like that, protected. If you have medical conditions like diabetes, or if you're a smoker or have been drinking, you're really at higher risk when you're out there because all those conditions right there compromise circulation. So the old drinking a shot of whiskey, to warm you up actually does quite the opposite. So let's talk about Windchill for a moment. This is another thing that kind of dovetails into these last two sections on the cold. And Windchill is basically the felt or perceived cold of the body when moving air contacts the skin. So the air is the same temperature all the way around, and although the temperature doesn't really change, it feels colder in windy conditions. Now, this in itself isn't necessarily dangerous, but remember convection from above, right? So as the wind increases, it draws more heat from the body, and it increases evaporation as well. So in this particular case, that's not a good thing. If we were in the desert, hey, wonderful. Wind chill only affects humans and animals that can feel the differences in temperature, right? So inanimate objects like plants, for example, they don't feel the wind chill. They just are what they are at the outside ambient temperature. So there's a chart here. This is readily available. I picked this up, and it's just an NOAA chart. You can find it anywhere, but it's a handy little thing that will show you the wind in miles per hour versus the x-axis of temperature in Fahrenheit and the relation between the two.